This feels like an awfully long time since we've done this, actually.
A lot happened, I think I was speaking to Kit about it recently. Like, I think there's been just a general sense of burnout, hasn't there, over the last several months?
Yeah, and the definite burnout. And then I went from, in the last quarter, as I think I'd said to you in the chat, where my work had just sort of stopped. It just gone off a cliff, and I couldn't work out why. And I was talking to other people who do the same thing, not for the same company, and they were like, "Yeah, it's happened to us as well." And we had all sorts of theories and so on. And then suddenly, very suddenly, in the last month or so, it's come back and then some. And then I got ridiculously busy, which is great because I had to make up a shortfall, obviously. But it was like, thank God, but it came back as quickly as it all just disappeared. And I'm in an industry where I know that you can have periods of nothingness, but this particular gig has been a consistent 15-year thing. I mean, like really consistent. When I was more of a mainstream actor, and you're doing bits of stage and bits of telly or bits of radio, whatever. And when that dried up, there was always this, and then suddenly there wasn't this. I was like,
peculiar that it was like across the industry as well. It wasn't just you and your corner of it. It was across the board.
Our various theories and the various rumors were either there had been some clog up with publishers that they just basically went, okay, we've got to stop. We've just got to basically stop pushing any text through to be made into audiobooks for a month or 5 weeks or 10 weeks. That was one theory. The other theory was they tried out AI and they realized it was costing them shitloads in energy bills, and of course they were getting the responses back that although it is far more sophisticated than it was, basically sentence stresses are still out, and it has a trouble with th and the. So it still does this thing where THs are sometimes pronounced th, or sometimes they're pronounced that. So you might have the word aesthetically said by the AI, but then you might have the word I don't know, like there pronounced there. Little things like that, or
can't
just
quite
the
get
last
its head around like the form.
And basically, and just the end consonants and ththings disappearing.
Well, and also it's expressionless. You can't listen to an AI. Even the I mean, I've heard on YouTube. You put a YouTube video on and it's going for a little while, and you think, is this an AI voice? I can't tell. If it is, it's a very good one. But after a few minutes, you can just tell because there just isn't that irregularity and unpredictability of human expression in it. It's just completely regular. It just speaks and and after a little while, if you try to keep, I mean, for me anyway, you try to keep listening to it for any length of time, it just grates on the soul. It's just.
Well, I find I slide off. I can't. It. I can't keep listening to it.
Ultimately, we're cheaper. Ultimately, human beings are going to be cheaper for that bit longer. And one day they'll realise what replacing all their living labour actually does to their profits.
I tell you what, I got lots of criticisms of the movie The Matrix, but one thing it did get right is that the machines would use us as a power source, because absolutely right. It doesn't work the other way around.
I mean, we are hurtling towards Remco's Basilisk, aren't we, at this point? We're just hurtling towards it, right?
Actually.
Although, having rewatched it recently, it is really cringe, that film. There are just elements of it where, like, aesthetically, I'm like, oh, stop.
Was this The Matrix?
Yeah.
I saw it when it came out. With a friend, and I think probably because I'd spent quite a bit of the 90s reading a lot of cyberpunk and a lot of anime, and so I was like, oh, is that it?
Etc.
And everyone around me seemed to be like, oh, this is the most extraordinary, revolutionary breakthrough thing, and I was like, No, I mean
That's the thing,
even
right?
the films
Ghost-
from that late period, whether it was something
Yes.
like Ghost in the Shell or
13th
they're so much
floor,
better,
etc. Yeah.
So yeah, I remember thinking, well, it's not that great.
I think what did it, it's the
Yeah.
fact that it was bringing all of those like Baudrillardian postmodern ideas to to a mainstream audience, wasn't it? That hadn't encountered.
And I was already probably Jean Baudrillard skeptical anyway. I'd already gone through my Baudrillard bit, and I probably because The Matrix came out when I was at university, so a lot of that I was sort of knocking back anyway and going,
Yes, of course.
well,
I've done a critical theory module. I know what this is talking about.
I'm really clever now.
Yeah, right. Well, I was a teenager. I was still a kid. I was still at high school.
I was still a teenager, I'll have you know.
just a university teenager,
Yeah, I was 19.
But I had seen, I had seen Ghost in the Shell, and Ghost in the Shell does do it better.
Yeah.
It does very much the same story, but it just does it.
There were a couple of other things around that time. Dark City, which was a bit earlier. Which was I love Dark City, and there was what's the film with Ralph Fiennes in? Strange
Days.
Strange Days. That's another
Catherine Bigelow movie. Yeah.
Not seen that for a number of years, but that was another. So probably because I'd seen those, some anime stuff, and been reading William Gibson. Whether it just,
of course,
of course, I was a very pretentious teenager, so I was like, oh well, this is so blasé,
Honestly, I would rather watch Johnny Mnemonic than The Matrix.
I would.
Hot mess of that film is. I find it a lot more entertaining, a lot less po-faced.
It's great fun.
Yeah.
I always had a problem with The Matrix because it does that really annoying thing where it draws a binary reality. So there is the simulated reality, which is absolutely simulated. And then there is the waking reality, which is absolute reality. And I even as a kid, I remember thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Of course.
For one thing, how do you define?
It undermines its own ability to be metaphorical, doesn't it?
Yes.
Because it's too literal.
The other thing, of course, is which Jack will completely know where I'm coming from. I had lived for about 10 years before The Matrix came out with The Deadly Assassin. So.
Yeah.
Which, they got there in 1976, guys.
Yeah, it's quite surprising, really. 76 Doctor Who story. The Doctor goes into a computer, which is literally called the Matrix,
which is powered by living human cells.
Yeah, absolutely. It's made of brain cells, and it's a computer, and it's called the Matrix. And he lies down on a couch, and they sort of attach electrodes to him, and he goes inside it, and it's a completely realistic 3D environment.
Nice.
It's except that of course weird, surreal things happen inside it. 1976 or 1975 or whatever it was. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's really at that time, really toying with the potential of digital landscapes and simulated realities. That's
way ahead.
And you even get a bit where the Doctor sort of shouts. He's standing on this cliff edge, and he shouts up into the sky, "I deny this reality!" And you get a shot of everything around him briefly looking like circuit boards and stuff like that.
Oh, wow.
It's all there in embryo.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
then of course you can
get Keanu in all his leather and PVC, or you can have Tom Baker in his billowing white sleeves, and I mean, it depends. Whatever's your poison, really.
Whatever's your kink. Yeah.
And talking of which, Hellraiser.
That was
the Hellbound art.
Good segue.
Thank you.
I set it up for you, and you you knocked it out of the park.
Very good. Very good.
Do you know what? I'll be honest with you, I just had to stop. I read the novella very fast. I mean, I basically scan read it because I haven't read it in years. But I have read it before, so that. And I watched the film, and I thought, I started just making a few things here and there as you do. And it's too big.
Yeah, it's very policy.
Too much. I could just
a lot going on here.
Could end up with far too much. I just thought, I think it's just going to be a case of have a few bullets and try and wing it, because there was this other part of me which was saying, well, this is George's baby, because it's Clive Barker, and you could actually be a very active listener. And then Jack came up with, I think I've got something, lads. And I was like, well, this is perfect. I can be a bit of a backseat.
Yeah. I must admit, I'm very intrigued. I want to know what Jack's interpretation of it is.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is why we are here.
Yeah, very intrigued.
How do we start this?
Oh, don't.
That's the problem, right?
Don't make me launch straight into my bit. Let's talk around it a bit first.
I think one thing I will say, just as an apology to both you guys and anyone crazy enough to listen, is that probably as I talk about them, it's going to be as almost one entity, because I think my thoughts will flip between the novella and the film. So I will try and make that clear by, when I, Rory and Larry, or when
Yes, that's my signifier.
But I think it's going to probably get a little bit bound up, because I sort of basically experienced them back to back, and so they're all a bit of a mush in my head. But I would try, where possible, to say, yes, I'm talking about the novella here, or yes, I'm talking about the film. It should be clear to anyone who knows why they're here, but it might just get a bit messy.
Well, that's fine. I mean, it's a very messy film, isn't it? Let's be honest. It is a very messy project.
The one thing I thought might be a good starting point was about basically any memories of the time.
Oh my God. Wow.
Because I know this one for me was part of I was very young when it came out, but certainly something which I did not see for years and years and years until I'd actually read quite a bit of Clive Barker, because I was a bit frightened of it. I was frightened of it because as I've said before on these, even though I have a tremendous attraction to horror and the uncanny and weird and gothic, I'm also very, very easily frightened by certain kinds of horror on film. And this one is sort of slap bang in that. It's body horror, it's manipulation of the flesh, it's viscera. And so I put it off for many, many years. And even when I first sat down to watch it, I was probably quite a way up in my 20s. It was with the cushion in front of me.
Funnily enough,
it took a long time to see this, and it was quite a sort of notorious big deal if you were a child of the 80s. It was like this monolithic film.
Well, it was everywhere, wasn't it? It's one of those films that's it's very hard to explain to people who were not around at the time how significant Hellraiser was, because it's like Alien. It's become like a cultural myth or an artifact now, isn't it? Everyone knows who Pinhead is. There were like Pinhead action figures and plushies and things now. Even people who've never seen the films, who've never read the books, know who Pinhead is and know what Hellraiser is in a very loose way. But at the time when Hellraiser hit in the 1980s, it was an atom bomb. It was a meteorite from heaven.
Well, one of my notes headlines just for the was it's a game changer. I actually think the novella and the film are both game changers in their way. The novella in a quieter way, but they are both game changers. So much of the genre we talk about had become, I think, a bit crystallized in terms of how monsters operated or how scenarios played out, and
it was all about
were very fixed, weren't they? They were fixed around things like slasher stuff and what memories we had of classic gothic horror, some SF adjacent stuff. You mentioned Alien, but the Thing as well, and Hellraiser the film really cracks that wide open. So it does, it is something of a type we hadn't quite seen before, although it is actually made up of a lot of imagery and staples of horror going right back into the traditions of it. It was never done quite this way.
Not in the same way, no. Aesthetically alone, I mean, I can imagine horror audiences of the time seeing the image of the Cenobites, for example. It's this character with this grid on his face and the pins nailed in, and thinking, what on earth is this? I've never seen anything quite like it before.
Yeah, but you can also get a vibe from the Hellbound heart as well. I say, and it's in a quieter way. That's quietly laying the groundwork for a lot of new kinds of drivers on horror fiction.
Very much.
I mean, and what comes across again, because I haven't read Clive Barker in a while now. A few years during lockdown, I reread Weave World.
My favorite, my absolute favorite. It's such a good book. It's such a good book.
I always sort of forget, and I don't know why, but what an original voice he is.
Honestly, it's annoying. It's freaking annoying. You come back to him after a while, and you even. I mean, the Hellbound Heart was his first published work, shortly before the Books of Blood, and even at this stage, although it is a more naive book than what would come later, and it's not as philosophically coherent as some of the stuff that would come later, absolutely. Even at this point, as a new writer, and as a writer as young as he was at that time, it's incendiary stuff.
I mean, purely as text, I love his prose here.
Nobody's writing like him. Nobody's writing like him at that time.
A degree of originality and not only an unexpected style, but unexpected content, without it feeling annoyingly self-conscious or a young writer, out to prove themselves. Of course, he would have been, but it's got a fairly balanced quality, and yet it does impress as prose.
Well, it's something that you find in Barker throughout his career, certainly his literary career. There is this lack of self-consciousness in his writing. He cares about what he's doing. He cares about exploring the ideas and throwing the images at the reader and evoking sensations, very visceral sensations. And it's really all he cares about. He's not that bothered about keeping up with the Joneses, for example, or emulating the career of, say, Stephen King, who would have been very prominent at the time and very aspirational for horror writers.
And turned out to be very complimentary of him, as it turned out.
Oh, well, I mean, people like King and Campbell were very much instrumental in Barker's rise. There was that point. I mean, it's very likely, even given the prominence of Hellraiser, it's very likely that Barker would have been a much smaller creative figure were it not for the fact that the Books of Blood landed somehow on Stephen King's desk at one point, and he gave him that incredible blurb. That incredible blurb that appears on practically everything ever published with Barker's name on it.
And on the Hellraiser trailers.
Yes. And on all of the Hellraiser trailers, yes. Yeah. I have seen the
audiences in 86 or 87 or whatever who saw the trailer in the cinema, or there were TV spots. And this kind of hooks into my personal story with this because yes, exactly 1987 I was 11 years old, and I was the kind of kid that was staying up late to watch horror movies on TV, to the extent that there were any horror movies on TV. So I mean, you never know, it could be a false memory, but I remember seeing a TV advert for this at the time and being absolutely sort of simultaneously terrified and absolutely fascinated by the image of Pinhead and that line, "We have such sights to show you." And I remember, again, it could be a false memory because memories of stories you tell yourself, but I remember the quote that it came up on the screen. "I've seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker, Stephen King." And it does.
Memory is just imagination in reverse.
Yeah,
I put that in my in my own story, and I don't know if it's. I'm afraid to look it up because I think it's someone else's words.
It's someone else's words.
But it hit me. But I think that's also part of memory, isn't it? That you tell yourself, "Oh, that's an original coin. You've coined a phrase," and actually, I'm thinking, "I bet it's someone's." I've got to look it up because I put it in my own prose as if it's mine.
I have a similar thing. At the start of the essay that I wrote about Don't Look Now, the opening line is, "Criticism is the art of reading in public." And I agonized over that because I thought, did I make that up, or is that a memory? Is that somebody else's? And I searched and searched and searched, and I couldn't find it anywhere else. So I just thought,
worries me is that when it feels like just the top of your head's been opened up, because I remember, and something's been put in, because I remember, when you get that. I mean, I'm only an amateur prose writer, but when you get that euphoria, when it's just when you have that moment where it just keeps flowing, and this phrase, and this phrase came out, the realization that memory was just imagination in reverse. And I went, whoa, hang on, that can't be me.
So good, isn't it? It's so good when that happens.
Because I live by pastiche and parody. I mean, I really do. Which is itself a quotation.
Well, at this point, let's be honest, no expression is entirely original, is it? So it's fine. It's something to not be too self-conscious of.
It's all a tissue of quotations.
Yeah.
It is, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's ambient. I mean, Hellraiser is ambient. I literally cannot remember a time before there was Hellraiser. It was one of those... it and the Hellbound VHS were on my mother's legendary shelves of VHSs.
I can't decide whether it was me discovering it so much later has proven a good thing or not, because I really put it off. I was because it was everything. I like you, Jack. I'd seen some clips, presumably of trailers or TV spots, and it was like, it's too much for me. I can't. I'm never going to be able to stare into that abyss.
Well, I did see it. I mean, I did see it far too young, and I mean, like, far too young. I saw
things
it
I saw young that I shouldn't have, but for some reason, this was like in a completely different league.
Yes, it did. I mean, that's kind of my experience too. Of all of the many, many, many horror films that are on those shelves, The Shining, the Amityville Horror, all of these films. Those two, Hellraiser and Hellbound, always had this slightly mythic quality to me, and I was always very reluctant to approach them. But because they had that quality, they also had the element of the forbidden about them. And every so often in my childhood, I would go and sort of brave them. It would be like, is it time now to return to this?
So when do you think was the first? How old do you think you were the first time you saw it?
I was not very old at all. I was young, like probably inappropriately young.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest,
because I saw things inappropriately young that were violent or horrific. You would always have that friend who was able to.
This is different.
But I do remember this was dangled in front of me by the same friend who I'd sort of seen The Shining with when as a kid. Around turning into double digits, but around turning into double digits, and things like, this is a shout out for Kit, things like RoboCop and
Yes.
He dangled this one in front of me, and I just no, and I thankfully he didn't rib me too much about it. He was much braver than I, but I was no. I just I can't. I can't. There's something about the atmosphere of the TV spot I saw, or the trailer I saw. Plus, I've had the rumor mill of the playground and everything. It's been transmitted to me what some of the content of this film is, and I'm not going to be able to handle it. The abusable human body is the endlessly abusable human body is a difficult one for me. I really, when it's in a fantastical situation, a la The Thing. I mean, this is a fantastical situation, of course it is. However, it's a fantastical situation which is playing with with reality, because we do know what has been capable of being acted on the human body, and it's I think it was that. It was like I don't think I can deal with that much disturbance of the human form.
So this is, these
unless it's like it's an alien or it's the Thing is entirely different, because I think the Thing just puts up its B movie genesis very, very strongly. So that was okay. But Hellraiser doesn't,
and it's not.
It's sort of saying
the thing isn't taking place in a house that looks like it could be just down the road as well. Yeah,
exactly.
Also, the transformations in The Thing are, in a bizarre way, kind of voluntary. When the creature transforms, it is transforming. It is altering its own flesh. Here,
it is weird.
It is strange and disturbing. But here, it's something external acting upon the body.
Yeah.
It's these outside agencies that are subjecting the body to technically unwanted pressures.
It's blades and it's wires and it's barbs and it's then you whoa.
These are, the film and the book are also minutely hyper focused upon that exploration as well. It's how far can you take the body, and not only the body but the sensation of it coming apart, the sensation of it being mutilated. And at what point do you lose all definition of that sensation. At what point does pain become pleasure? At what point does pleasure become pain? At what point do those notions just dissolve because it's just a wash of extremity? It's
there is a fundamental, I think, aesthetic disjunction between the novella and the film, which is that the film is very laser focused on bodily mutilation. It's very definitely the tortures that are aside from the appearance of the Cenobites, we do get a very slight glimpse of what goes on in the hell world, with Frank and when he's their prisoner. And it's hooks and knives and blades and chains and blood. It's definitely, bits are being sawn off and pierced and stabbed and stuff like that. The novella is actually very vague about what is actually being done. It doesn't really go into any detail. It talks in generalities. It
really
talks about
does.
the engineer fashioning machines for the provision of grief and things like that. But you don't get specifics, whereas the film just says, they're sawing his cock off or whatever.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. The book is far more ethereal, isn't it? What the Cenobites are about is far more abstract. Even the Cenobites themselves, even though they are quite specifically detailed.
It's definitely physical pain. It's definitely physical torture.
But
the book doesn't tell you what it is.
No. And also, it's more magical, isn't it? There's that whole thing at the beginning, which you don't really get in the film, when Frank first summons the Cenobites in the book, where they tell him there are conditions of the nerve endings that you cannot conceive of. And one of the first things they do to him, they don't touch him. One of the first things they do to him, there's no knives, there's no hooks, there's no blades. They give him this abstract experience where every minute sensation becomes very, very specific. So he can feel like motes of dust against his eyes, and he can see flies in the shadows in muck, and he's experiencing the rumbling of his own entrails like it's thunder. It's not
the extreme physicalization of why we approach this genre ourselves, which is to have the psychological, the emotional hit of there is that divided thing of wanting to be entertained and gain pleasure from horror, but at the same time feel a certain kind of grueling experience, to be to be frightened. It's just rather than operating, well, of course it's still operating on the bodily level. It's just it's just that one degree of, well, more than 1 degree of separation. But so in a sense there is a complicity already, even though it's like,
it's almost like with that particular scene for me, it's almost like Barker's manifesto on body horror. He's bringing it down to just a body experiencing itself. All the sensations that Frank experiences are ostensibly normal sensations. They're just exaggerated to ridiculous extremes. It's Barker basically saying, we're going to be talking about the horror of the body itself, of existing in these carcasses, and of experiencing reality through them.
It's the removal of perceptual filters, isn't it? Because if you did feel everything that was going on in your body and to your body all the time, it would be constant agony. If you didn't have the ability to filter what you were hearing, then a room full of people would be torment.
It's maddening, right?
At any given moment, your toes are feeling something, and if you're sitting in a chair, your buttocks are being compressed, and that there's a cold breeze touching this bit of your skin, and the fabric of your clothes are rubbing against that bit of your skin. If you felt it all at once, it would just be a completely unbearable cacophony. You need mentally that ability to filter and concentrate on this bit at a time, which is obviously, it's necessary for us to make sense of life, just of our environment, of our own bodies. We need that, but it is a kind of a just to function, exactly. Because as I say, if you didn't have it, everything just existing would be a kind of constant torture of overstimulation. But at the same time, it is just kind of an inherent limitation to us as beings. And I think the idea. I mean, I don't want to be reductive about it, but that bit in the novel, the novella, where they sort of tenderize him, ready for what's coming later. It does read a bit like a bad drug experience, and that's what a bad experience on hallucinogens or something like that can be like. That it can be like your brain stops filtering. And you're getting everything at once. You're getting every mote of dust and every particle of light and every decibel of anything going on, all at once.
And this is the interesting dichotomy as well, because good drug trips can also be like that, where you feel as though you are open to everything and everything is coming in at once, but somehow the anxiety isn't there. Somehow it becomes welcome.
Of course, the supreme positive about pain, as I discovered only this week, because and it did amuse me watching Hellraiser and reading Hellbound afterwards, because I had to go to the eye hospital last week, because when I had COVID a few years ago, my first and still thankfully touch wood only brush with COVID, I got some terrible eye infections that had been really bad, and I started to experience a something or other under my eyelid. So when I'm going down to the eye hospital, and they very much looked upon me as if I was some kind of hypochondriac for ages, because they had me under the scope going, there's just nothing. What are you feeling? Be describing what I'm feeling, and then okay, well, we'll try this. They ran up, we'll put a dye through your eye, see if the dye shows up anything. No. Are you sure that you're just not? No. And then eventually they passed it on to someone a bit more senior, and he started to giggle. He was looking under my eyelid and said, "You have one very, very tiny." He used a term like ganglion, but it wasn't quite that. That is ever so slightly inflamed, like negligible. He said, "I think you're hyper aware of this part of your body because of what you experienced." He said, "I would not expect a patient to be aware of what you're feeling for weeks." He said, "But on the plus side, it means that we've nipped it in the bud." And he gave me this, that, and the other medication. He said, "Basically, this is going to be gone before it starts." He said, "But typically, I would be seeing you in 3 weeks when your eye is inflamed." He said, "So isn't pain a wonderful thing?" And I just thought for a moment, I'm doing Hellraiser soon. I said, "Well, yes, it is." But he said, "In your case," he said, "it's given you one heck of a tip-off about something that in 3 weeks' time would have been a bit nasty." I was like, great!
With regards to Hellraiser and its mythology, that is a really good point, actually, because one of the things that, besides the aesthetics...
I had a degree of enlightenment through pain.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But one of the things, besides the aesthetics of the film, that makes it so incendiary in context is the way it recontextualizes pain and bodily mutilation. I mean, in most works of horror, pain is entirely negative. It is something you want to avoid. It is something that the monster or the killer inflicts. Here, there is an ambiguity with regards to pain and with regards to bodily mutilation. The experience the Cenobites give to Frank, people seek it out. Even people who know what the Cenobites are going to give them, people seek it out. They solve the box. There are the Cenobites themselves, who are these oddly mutilated and yet also papal and composed and regal and oddly beautiful creatures.
And our attraction to it is strange, because, of course, it also reminded me of being young and doing things like, well, this is really, the tail end of the 90s. Well, I'll go and get a tattoo. So scarification. Right. I'll go and get parts of me pierced, which I did. Yeah. It seems strange now. I think this is like another person. And part of that is, I think, some kind of testing. You think, why?
There's a fanatic thrill to it as well, isn't there? There's a kind of fanatic thrill where it reminds you simultaneously that you are alive, but your body is also mortal. It can be damaged. You are going to die someday.
Of course, it was the end of the 90s, so it was some kind of bloodletting to the millennial gods.
Right.
If I did.
Funnily enough, I was watching I've watched so much material on Hellraiser out there, and I was watching a documentary where Barker was interviewed, and he was talking about how he this was a long time ago, this was after Hellraiser, he would be getting letters from people who, they're called modern primitives, And they are people who put on almost like carnivalesque shows where they essentially replicate things like what you see in Hellraiser. They test the limits of the body. They feed.
Look at the end of the the 90s. Artists like Orlan. Remember the French artist Orlan, who she did a number of things. I think she was interesting enough, considering where also Hellraiser goes. I think she was using vocabulary, not quite like non-binary, but using a vocabulary similar to that. She was basically talking about herself as being freed of gender, I seem to remember.
Wow.
There was another one, Stellarch, as well. There was an artist called Stellarch, and there was Ron Athey, who used to do... he used to pierce himself. He was a performance artist. He used to pierce himself on stage, and he would put the blottings of the blood onto sort of hangers that would be hung out over the audience. Extraordinary stuff. But again, it's that same time, yeah.
Wow. I mean, there was some footage as well of these modern primitive performances, and the extremes to which they put their bodies, the stretched taut skin, the hanging from hooks and whatnot, it's simultaneously absolutely incredible and somewhat difficult to watch. Because this is
the popular version of it was things like Jim Rose Circus, wasn't it? I mean, that was the sort of popularized image of the body and so on.
People have been doing things like that for as long as they've been people.
As long as they've been human beings, yeah, absolutely. It's not a new thing. It's not a new thing.
No, it's ancient. I think it's very much tied up with religious practices. I think quite specifically with non-Christian religious practices, although Christianity does have, of course, a sort of a visual fascination with torture and bodily mutilation.
Certainly one biggie. That's coming
exactly.
Up, in fact.
Yeah, but Christianity has historically it's tended to, at least in its orthodox iterations, which are of course bound up with hierarchical power structures of property and so on and so forth, it has tended to suppress things like self-mutilation in the seeking of religious experiences, religious transcendence and stuff like that. But that is something that human beings have been doing for ages. And I think there's a very good video on YouTube by somebody called The Morbid Zoo about talking about Hellraiser. And I think it is she who makes this point, which is that things like bodily scarification and tattoos have become so incredibly popular in recent decades, and I think she says it's because of the decline of the influence of organized Christianity in our cultures. It's sort of smothering influence of something like that very old religious impulse. It's led that to come back. And it is bound up with there's another good video on YouTube actually by CCK Philosophy, Jonas Selke, called I think it's called Hellraiser and Bataille, and it's about sort of tying Hellraiser in with Georges Bataille's idea of limit experiences.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, and limit experiences do. I mean, I think Bataille actually gets limit experiences quite a bit wrong, but it is often tied up with the seeking for some sort of religious transcendent experience or visionary experience.
Or
and that's all seeking ecstasy in the sense of,
right?
The obliteration of the self, and communion or apparent communion with something vast and spiritual outside oneself through that sort of self-annihilation, ironically through the complete subsumption of your own thinking self in your sensations.
Yes, your ego, just how you identify or define. It's taking away the body itself, isn't it, as a means of self-identity. That's what happens to Frank. But of course, Frank is so lacking in any wider nous that he can't appreciate it. He can't go far enough. He's not like, say, Chenard in the follow-up, or even the human beings who become the Cenobites. He wants to escape. He wants to get back to the mundane.
the big secret about Frank and Larry, which neither of them would like, is that they are very similar.
They're similar, yes.
Frank is just much better looking.
Yeah, that's it.
But
they are
he is
aesthetically
fundamentally
different.
Fundamentally, he's a very similar sort of small and petty and unimaginative sort of person. He thinks he's seeking new experiences.
He's such a fucking edgelord, isn't he? He's such a fucking edgelord. What is it he says to Julia? It'll be like love, only real.
That's a great line, but it is a
it's such a
fedora thing to say.
Adolescent Jordan Peterson piece of shite, isn't it? You know,
about Frank, isn't it? You know, the great libertine, the sort of sexual adventurer, and I mean, certainly in the film, he's having like this real vanilla sex with Julia in Mish, yes. You know, in Missionary. And
to be fair,
but then what then happens is you start going, well, hang on a moment, is this what she can't live without? My God, how bad is Larry in bed?
Yeah. Well,
and no wonder Frank sought the box, because you know, is that as far as his so-called sexual adventurism goes?
Yeah.
You know,
well, we get that at the beginning. We get that at the beginning of the book, don't we? When he asks them for pleasure. I mean, there's also much more conversation in the book. Obviously, when the Cenobites first appear to Frank, they talk to him. They're really bored, by the way. They're really disinterested in him. They speak in these kind of dusty sighs where they're like, yes, what do you want? They're very, very bored, and he asks for pleasure, and it gives you some interiority for Frank. He assumes they're going to come with concubines, effectively, with women, and it's like
his imagination stretches only to sort of a version of the stereotypical Muslim heaven for martyrs, doesn't it? He just wants the 72 virgins. It's also, that
he's
boring,
very straight, isn't he? He's very straight as well. For somebody who considers themselves this great libertine, I've gone to the edges of sensory experience. Really, Frank?
You've gone to the edges of your imagination, Frank. That's what you've done.
That's it, which is very narrow.
That wasn't very far to go.
in a sense, what the Cenobites do is they queerify Frank before he's returned to what is brilliantly referred to in the novella as the damp room. So then what happens? He needs male flesh. But again, you know, it gets all sort of complicated around here. But I'm not going to jump off into that quite yet, because I've got all sorts of things about the film and the novella that sort of keep me awake at night. But yeah, they totally queerify him. And I like this idea of Jack's about the sort of the doubling thing, because I do think they are essentially the same person. Yes. And I think they're both boring men. They're just boring examples of the patriarchy. One particularly toxic, masculine, very straight man who's just out to dominate women. I mean, as you say, this is why the Cenobites need to queerify him in a sense, because he is so thunderingly straight and so thunderingly misogynistic about it, and he can't deal with it. But the interesting, obviously, quirk is then, of course, I think it goes into areas which are a little bit tricky, but of course he needs to be made flesh, and he needs that by effectively merging with men. And so this becomes the one of the drivers of the plot. But of course, it absolutely follows with what the Cenobites have put him through. He is now very aware of male flesh, and he needs male flesh. But they are the same man, so I totally agree with you. And I think that you might have made a comment, Jack, in the back chat, which I went, that's absolutely it. In a sense, Andy Robinson should be playing both of them. I think he was still at an age where he could have been younged up a bit, you know, younged back a bit. He could have got away. Or, you know, I mean, I love Andy Robinson. I wouldn't want anyone else in the role. Or you cast someone else entirely, someone who's on that cusp where they can play the. I mean, I think it's 19 years in the novella or something crazy, isn't it? But let's say 9 years difference between the brothers or whatever. Or, you know, it's a film. Make them twins. I mean, God, who cares?
Twins. Yeah, I think, you know, I'm totally with Jack on that one. I think making them twins would. I mean, if they ever remake this story, if they ever remake this particular film, it'd be wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But with regards to Julia, as to why she's so desperate to get Frank back, in a way, she's not. In a way, what's happening is she's so defeated by patriarchy. She's so ground down that she's looking for anything, any escape, even if it's a false escape.
Immensely sympathetic about Julia. I mean, indeed, any woman having to be a part of that sort of familial structure in patriarchy. Sexually unfulfilled. Someone who has resisted motherhood but has ended up in a ready-made family unit in the film. Obviously, it's different in the novella. Someone who is, and a great deal of it comes across in the actress' performance as well. But someone of ability,
Claire
intelligence,
Higgins is fabulous in this film. I mean, she's
so good, and because actually on paper, and in on the novella, Julia's not always, terribly interesting as a character. It's the predicament, but the realization, Julia, both the novella character and the film character, realizing that she has been cribbed and confined. But I guess the difficulty, again, it's one of the many difficulties I sort of have with this, and I'm sure we'll get on to it, because Clive Barker doesn't, to my mind, do anything in bad faith, and I think he is an example of a writer trying to be incredibly progressive. I wonder if it is either to do with the limitations of these genres, or maybe something to do with the actual period in which he was writing. But she has to be kind of made into the evil sexualized woman, albeit male controlled, as her only route out of this, which just feels a bit, particularly when she's thrown against Kirsty, who is purity and innocence, and someone who rejects the queerness of the Cenobites, and is the de facto heroine of the piece, really. Straight, respectable woman. Yet she inverts the trope about bi or gay men who murder young men and women. Julia, I mean. But she's actually the conduit by which Frank does this. So it does it does also end up reinforcing that reading. So I think what I'm basically trying to say is I think that through both the novella and the film, there is this kind of divided ethic where Barker is striving for something, usually striving for something very positive and actually quite progressive. And he ends up in sometimes shackling reactions somewhere else.
Yes,
I think you're
right. I think it's the time, the era of the writing, and I also think it's the fact that he's he is essentially a new writer at this point. This is his first real work. But I think you are right. I think the fact that both the book and the film ultimately feel as though they have to punish Julia at the end, when in fact she has been. I mean, I don't know whether the film intends this, but from my reading of the film,
Kirsty as well, beyond what I think the character is deserving of. Both versions as well.
I mean, what's really interesting about the way Kirsty's presented in the book, that doesn't really have much time for her. Like, the narrative voice doesn't have much time for her. She's variously described as this fusty kind of conservative, very sort of like. The way she invades the familial household, the structure.
And yet that does give her something of agency, which she doesn't have in the film. I mean, she does want to remove Julia from the picture to be with Rory. Whereas in the film, of course, she's basically Nancy from Elm Street, but removed to the fringes of the narrative, which I think is interesting because the young victim or heroine or final girl of these pieces is, even then was a recognizable staple of that form. But I think the smart thing is that she's not the central focus in the film any more than the Cenobites are, actually. What the film is to a large extent about is this rather horrible serial killer thing, where Julia is sort of Netley to Frank's Jack the Ripper, or Cove to his Count Dracula, if we're going to go to Hammer, and that's really what the film is about. But I think the trickiness of the film and the novella is that Barker doesn't quite get us to a point where we can hammer out how much Julia is the evil sexualized woman manipulated by, or the victim of a manipulative man, or why she is punished in the way she is, when there is an awful lot of sympathy for her, quite rightly at the beginning. Even allowing for the fact of what she does and what she becomes involved in. I think the fall and the conclusion of the Julia arc in both pieces is disappointing.
It is a little bit, and it's why it's so wonderful to see her in Hellbound, isn't it? And what actually happens to her,
and
where she is,
because it should not end with Frank killing Julia. It should end with Julia killing Frank.
Yes,
absolutely. It should end with Julia realizing that she never needed this thing, and that her memory, this idealized memory she has of this sexual encounter, it's a delusion. It's just another
right there because without the identical twins thing for the brothers that I suggested, you have two very distinct men, right? But at the end, they've merged. Frank has literally put on Larry's skin. He has essentially become Larry. So he has re-achieved genderedness, maleness. He's re-achieved sort of humanity and bourgeois middle class respectability, and he's he basically just is Larry to all intents and purposes. And that should make it clear to Julia. I've just exchanged one guy for one functionally identical guy.
One trap.
I haven't.
Trap.
Yeah, I'm back exactly where I was before. And she should. That should trigger Julia's. Julia should suddenly see Frank clearly now that he looks like Larry, and she should say, "Fuck this! I'm getting rid of this guy too." I've killed so many men now. What's one more? What's one more worthless guy?
A better ending is where she does exactly that, and she is the one that emerges from Lodovico Street, right, and goes off on her own adventures and her own journeys, maybe carrying the box with her,
Yeah, take Kirsty out of it completely, to be honest.
Julia is enough.
Totally. Yeah. As an emblem of what patriarchy does to women. Yeah, absolutely. Julia is just a more interesting character. She really is. Kirsty's kind of on the side, she's not that particularly in the book, and the book acknowledges so much about itself. Like, it not only acknowledges the fact that Kirsty is the less interesting character, it's actually innate, it's part of her character. Julia thinks about this.
Brilliant line he has about her, she of the pale handshake, which is such a great description. The pale handshake.
See, Frank sees her. He sees her from the window of Lodovico Street, and he gets, in the classic sort of psychopath way, he gets her immediately. He sees, like, this is a repressed and conservative and sort of mousy woman who I can really dominate, I can ruin, I can destroy,
well, that's what he thinks anyway.
That's what he thinks, of course.
I think there is a little bit more to Kirsty than that in the book. But I think one of the things that you do get in the film by making Kirsty into Frank's daughter, of course, is that you do get a kind of a hint of incestuousness to the Frank Kirsty scenes.
Yes, definitely. And there's also like an emotional
incest tidies things up as well, actually, just on a very basic storytelling level. I think it just tidies things up because reading the novella, it just about gets away with it because it is a novella. But there would be an awful lot of setup needed in the film to make to establish those relationships and why they and how they know Kirsty. Whereas I think it's good because it's also it's tapping into the other aspect of the film, which is the nuclear family and the age of neoliberalism.
There's also like a
Reaganism, at that point, and everything. I mean, this film is so bristling with stuff about property relations and actually what the family is in those kinds of relations. And
everyone objectifies everyone else, don't they? Everyone objectifies everyone else. So Kirsty is objectified, both Julia and Larry. Larry is her property. Julia is an invader. Because, of course, Julia isn't her mother. Julia is her stepmother.
Yeah, stepmother.
Yeah, and we don't really know much about the previous relationship. I don't think it's ever even
mother's not mentioned really, or the first wife. It's not really. Well, we don't even get really the information on his dead mother. Again, it's not the important thing. The important thing is that this house is there, and the value of this house, and getting this house, and ownership, and the nuclear family being in this house. Those are the important things.
Well, the film has that really interesting symbolic thing that happens at the end, where you get the shot of Lodovico Street after everything has gone down, and then you get superimposed over it the fire that's burning the photograph. I think it's of Julia and Frank. It's really interesting. It's
and of
like
course the house is
the photograph.
The house is the box. The house is also
absolutely right.
The Lamont configuration, or the Le Marchand's box. That's what it is. It's.
Well, I mean, that goes right down to the minutiae of the design. If you look at the box, and I've got a Lament configuration, by the way. If you look at the box, you can see scenes from the film in it. The engineers in it. Larry Rory or rather Frank in Larry Rory's skin when he's stretched to extremis at the end is in the box. It's all of the story is sort of told symbolically in the Lament configuration. It's almost as though everything has already happened and it's happening on multiple levels of reality. It's like the labyrinth in Hellbound. The labyrinth in Hellbound is simultaneously it's inside Chenard's head, but it's also not. It's also inside the box, but it's also its own dimension. There are this playing with existentialism that happens throughout the mythology that's really, really interesting. And it happens as well. You have that weird kind of like spatial dislocation that happens in films. Like, really, to be honest, what has Larry never been into that fucking room?
And there's a very strange moment where Julia gets to it very, very quickly, even though she's crawling, because the scenes are taking place in real time. So you get this. You're not sure if it's an editing error or whether it's sort of, again, because the spatial dimensions of the house, like the box, are skewed.
Right.
She's like, there's one moment where she's like, oh, she's there. How did she get there? How did she get there?
Yes, there is a bit at the end as well. You know, after Frank has stabbed her and then fed on her. And she ends up, there's just a scene missing, I think. I think there's just a scene missing. Because she ends up on the infamous mattress upstairs with the box in her hands and the hook. She's obviously sold the box somehow at some point as well. And the hooks are sort of in her face and have ripped it open. So that's very peculiar, actually. I mean,
like temporality as well as spatial. It's all.
And we know that this happens, right? I mean, we've had it established at this point that when the box is opened and when the Cenobites come, their reality kind of superimposes itself on ours and alters it in very significant spatial ways. So you get that hallway opening up in Kirsty's hospital room, which can't possibly be there, and it's way too long. You know, it goes on forever, and the engineer is at the end of it, and so on and so forth.
That's one of the ways in which this sort of horror story very much resembles children's storytelling in a very strange way. The secondary world fantasy of the kind where you walk to the back of the wardrobe and you find Narnia, or you go to the wood between the worlds and stuff like that, or you walk into the police box. Even it's that idea of impossible space leading to other possible worlds. That's all the way through early to mid 20th century children's fiction.
It really is, isn't it? It really is. And Lewis is a great shout, actually, because he is one of the foundational writers for Barker. A lot of Barker's
sense, because as you get older, when you get older, these stories from childhood, which for many of us become fascinating again, they make us uneasy in ways they didn't make us uneasy as children. We just accepted their logic as children.
Absolutely.
But so then transplanting that into quote unquote adult horror is highly effective, because of course you're tapping into the basic childhood fears as well at the same time, because you're drawing on those exact same scenarios and concepts, as you say. Like
Barker will, of course, he will come back round again with his later fiction when he starts to acknowledge the wonder and the potential and the revelation of that with books like Weave World and Sacrum and so on and so forth, which are neither one thing nor the other. I mean, people have real difficulty with those books. They have difficulty because they are kind of beyond categorization. They are not horror or science fiction or fantasy. They are their own things,
Peter Cushing actually said something like this once. He was being interviewed and people asked, so the interviewer said to him, how do you feel about having spent so much of your career doing horror films? And he said something very interesting. He said, I really don't think of these as horror films. They're fantasy. They're fantasy for grown-ups. And I think that is absolutely true. When you look at those sorts of the Hammer films and the Dracula Frankenstein Hammer films, that's very much what they are. And then when you look at, I mean, I think I've said this to you before, but I feel that Hellbound and Labyrinth are essentially the same movie, just at different registers.
Totally. Absolutely.
Absolutely they are. I mean, it sounds a strange thing to say, but when you step back and you stop responding to the aesthetics, they are. There are very similar themes at play, and even overlaps in imagery and tone as well.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then very, very strange for a situation with a few years off. Well, no, it was probably quite near Hellbound, actually, which is Bill and Ted's Bogus Adventure, which seems to be taking place in the same strange domain as Hellbound. So now and again, I keep expecting Kenneth Branagh to be running into Keanu Reeves. It's like, what's going on? And again, I mean, not to be too flippant about it, but the second Bill and Ted film is incredibly strange. I mean, it is borderline horror. It is so odd that they basically got it in off the back of the first one. Obviously, the box office success of the first one, but it is deeply strange.
Yeah. It does seem as though these things were preoccupations of the era, doesn't it? Like, across fiction, certainly across certain kinds of cinema. I really do think like the Labyrinth is a fantastic show.
But I think in a way it's a good point maybe to remember that Clive Barker, as well as a few years earlier being this sort of firebrand novelist, he's also now in this film a filmmaker. And one of the things I find fascinating about Hellraiser is because he gets to make the Hellbound hard as a film, and he's on a limited budget,
limited budget, like ridiculous,
and
ridiculous.
And he's smart. He knows what the censors and distributors will probably allow for. But what's interesting, I thought watching it again for this, was that every lapse in Hellraiser, if you like, kind of works out for him. And one of the things we've talked about is that sort of weird transatlanticism, the fact that the money that ain't there to do all that much with the Cenobites as well, so the film ends up being structured more around Julia and Frank and Larry, which at least means we get this kind of as a groundbreaking horror in the sense that it is a sort of intelligent character piece that shows and of course it's showing where the real horror lies. But I think referencing Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, I mean, the film. The beauty of that film, of course, which he didn't direct, is that puts the Cenobites in their realm obviously absolutely central. So there isn't a sense which you do get on the first film of well, this isn't really what I paid my money to see, but I accept that it is mostly very good and mostly pretty smart at doing something I wasn't really here for, because you watch it going, hang on a moment, the Cenobites don't turn up until almost the very end. And
not in it
dealt
very
with
much
in
at all.
a few minutes, and the surreal or dreamlike aspects of it are just peppered throughout. This is basically a serial killer movie and a dysfunctional family movie.
And a family drama, right? And also a kind of French farce. I mean, there are elements of French farce in this. There's that wonderful sequence where after Julia has committed her first murder, which by the way is beautiful. Yeah. It's so brilliantly done, and it's all Claire Higgins. It's all Claire Higgins. Her response to it is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. You get that wonderful. She plays shock really well.
Yeah,
really sincerely.
This is a film. It's also, like you were saying, it's like a French farce. Well, it's also a 60s kitchen sink drama, sort of via 80s EastEnders, but displaced to some kind of, as you say, transatlantic dreamscape, or then it's a bit like a Pinter play. You could actually, I've thought watching going, you could do Hellraiser as a Pinter play where you don't see anything visceral. You don't have any. You don't see the Cenobites, but you just get hints from very weirdly stilted dialogue and Rory behaving like Frank in the final act.
Yeah. So you just get Julia going upstairs every so often, you know,
as you would in the Homecoming or something like the Homecoming, you know. But the film has that same "it's England through a distorted lens" as Paper House as well, which also feels a bit like the plot of Hellraiser from another angle. That's another film that I think you could, with a few little bits of, you know, moving it around. Paper House and Hellraiser. I mean, the abusive father, the heavily implied abusive father in Paper House, could be Frank. You know, so there's another sort of point around this time, around this kind of 5-10 year span of filmmaking, a film set in Britain, where it has another little piece of the puzzle,
as it were. Paper House, of course, another story about you know, reality, you know, the surface of reality being broken in some sort of figurative way, and you being able to walk into impossible spaces. Very much the same sort of thing in the same sort of time.
And it just struck me. It's going back a couple of bits in the chat, but it just hit me again what you were saying earlier, Jack, about the doubling of Frank and Larry or Rory. You know, in a way, this story is about, or could be interpreted as, if you like, the literalization of Rory's repressed view of himself. Frank is this sort of concept in him. He wants to be like Frank, and in fact, it's all about your frankness, isn't it? Your frankness to be something that you know, you feel you should censor. So again, I think this idea. I'm sorry, I just took us back a bit, but only because I just think this idea of the twinning.
I think it's very poignant. I think it's really poignant. I mean, there's also like a Freudian element.
There, you let the id out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's overt, really, isn't it? It's not
because Larry is really buttoned down. I mean, I think the really one of the great moments in the film. It's not particularly subtle, but it still works. Is the subtle Hellraiser, where he's watching the boxing, getting his sexual hit vicariously, sublimated through that boxing, and I think Andy Robinson plays that really interestingly as well. But there it is. It's because Frank he's already Frank.
But Larry's watching Julia to see if it's all right for him to react that way. He keeps on looking across at her like, am I going to get in trouble for reacting this way to the boxing?
He's so infantilized, isn't he? He's almost like a portrait of what patriarchy does to men, right?
Yeah. And of course, it's all about wearing other people's skins. It's about impersonation. It's about role play. It's about adopting roles, of course. But yeah, that thing of like, this is what the damage patriarchy does to men as well as women. And Rory Larry is that guy.
This film is pitiless in its depiction of heterosexual men. It is excruciating. Really, I mean, for me as a heterosexual man watching it, like the stuff with the hooks and the knives and everything, that's nothing compared to the depiction of heterosexual mating rituals. Larry is an excruciating picture of the sort of the man baby bloke, particularly the bit where he cuts his hand and he just finds he doesn't go to the first aid cabinet or anything. He just finds his wife stroke mummy and holds his boo-boo out to her and says, you deal with this.
It's so amazing. It's wordless, isn't it? And it's the way he holds his hand out to her and he can't look because he's going to faint. And she's like, oh, and she, by the way, at that point, she hasn't done anything she hasn't like witnessed anything terrible or ever. She's just the woman of the household, and therefore she just deals with this stuff. You know, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's just her job. And then the depiction of the guys that she picks up and brings home, particularly the first one. It is skin crawling. I have to give props to the actor. Actually, I don't know his name, but he gives a brilliant little performance in that role as this absolutely, just absolutely dreadful, but absolutely standard type of cis-het bloke. It is painful to watch, but it's so well observed in the way that really I think only a man who is gay could possibly see us so head on and so mercilessly.
It is consistent in Barker's fiction, I will say. It's rare that the straight cis guys come off well.
Fair play.
It's incredibly rare.
But I love the other connotation in those sequences as well, because obviously you have the connotation with, I was saying, the queerifying of Frank by the Cenobites and the need for man flesh. But there's also the other connotation, given the very strong context of the film, given its very strongly 1987-ness, that Frank is now literally a self-made man, and he does it by consuming business rivals. He knocks out the competition, ruthlessly feeds on it until he is made in their image.
And they are very much like coded as yuppies, aren't they?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, one's a white boy. Yeah, and the other's a city guy, and absolutely, yeah.
So that's an interesting doubling at the same time that you do get that kind of the queerifying of Frank, that he has to essentially merge with men, but there's also the as I say, the very strong 1987-ness of it, the sort of peak neoliberal yuppies and Y-boys and knocking out the competition and being a self-made man.
And which also there's a layer of irony to that as well, because he's not, is he? It's Julia that brings him the men,
Julia that's doing it.
And it's her desire that brought him back. It's her need that summons him back. It's not the blood that Rory/Larry spills is incidental. That's a reagent. That is just the material. The way the film in particular is edited and cut, you've got that wonderful sequence where Larry, it really is good, isn't it? I mean, it is one of the areas where Barker, he's a very inexperienced director. He's never done it before. And sometimes you can see that. But this is really beautiful, this sequence, where you've got the marital bed, the mattress being carried up the stairs by Larry. And
he's really fighting with it. He's struggling, which is showing him to be
weak and pathetic, the weaker guy. And basically unworthy of it, right? He's unworthy of what he wants. And it's intercut with this brilliant sequence where Julia is fantasizing about wanting Frank back of this idealized sexual encounter that they had, and it's
presumably they're having it on her and Larry's bed, and she's wearing. I mean, in the novella,
dress. The wedding dress, isn't it?
I don't know if it's I can't remember if it's very specifically the wedding dress in the film, but it's definitely sort of white lacy wedding night looking lingerie, whereas in the novella it's very specific. Yeah. But so I mean, Larry is being completely cucked, but at the same time, as I say, Larry and Frank kind of the same person, because as you say, it's Julia's desire, it's Julia's memories. Maybe they're even false memories, rose tinted memories constructed in the misery of her boring marriage. That's what brings him back. And
now,
then
the
he
Cenobites could have actually revealed to Frank, to Larry, actually the power that he could gain from being a cuck, but he doesn't reach them in time.
He's not worthy of it in the same way that Larry isn't worthy of the marital bed, right? The things they seek, the things they idealize in their minds, and that they claim to want, and that they identify by, both brothers, they are not worthy of it, and they're not the equal of it.
And Julia has to do it all for Frank in the same way that she has to do everything for Larry. Larry comes to Julia with the wound, and exactly the same way Frank, albeit with a much bigger wound, a more existential wound, a more drastic wound, he comes to Julia and says, "Sort this out for me." She's the one that has to. For both of those men, she is the one that has to do with blood. She is the one that has to provide the fluids. She is mummy for both of those blokes.
Yeah, she's fucking mother. She's mother, isn't she? They don't even, for all Frank's bluster about his libido and whatnot, he doesn't want lovers or partners or even like disposable bits on the side. He wants a mother in the same way that Larry does.
Yeah, and Frank has his catchphrase, doesn't he? "Come to daddy," which is very much an attempt to inhabit the ultimate patriarchal role, isn't it? It's and when he says it to Kirsty, there's a very definite sort of very unsettling sexual incestuous tinge to it. You can't help wondering if Frank was creepy about little Kirsty when she was a kid.
There's definitely that implication going on here. If they ever did like a Netflix series of this or something, that would definitely be a subplot.
Yeah, you can imagine a few years back, when Kirsty's like 13 or something, Uncle Frank comes round, and it's all too easy to imagine. But he's definitely, and he tries to inhabit the role of daddy as well. He actually tries to become her daddy at one point. He is trying very consciously to assert that male dominance in that stereotypically sort of archetypal male patriarchal role, and of course he can't pull it off. He can't manage it. He's a failure at that.
Yeah, it's just not him, is it? Also, I mean, there's another echo here, which is of course the almost Electra complex thing that's going on between film Kirsty and Larry. There is something about their relationship, the way it's framed. It's never overt. There's nothing ever anything overt in it, but there is a feeling, and it seems to come more from Kirsty's side, interestingly, where she seems to idealize her father in a very particular way, to the point whereby the boyfriend is like, blink and you'll miss him.
Yeah,
he's almost completely disposable, right?
Yeah,
if he didn't get out of the house at the end, would she notice, and would you as the audience notice? Probably not.
It's interesting to ponder what that character thinks is happening at the end, because he hasn't seen so much as a glimpse of anything supernatural up to this point. As far as he knows, he's just going to his girlfriend's house, and suddenly all hell breaks loose. No pun intended. It's like this guy, this character is clearly studio mandated, and he might as well be called Jim Studio Mandated, to be honest.
Or Stewart Mandate or something. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. I mean, it would have potentially been much more interesting if there was a greater runtime, or if it was in the format of a series or something like that. Because of course, all of that Electra complex stuff between Larry and Kirsty, with a boyfriend in the picture as well, would have been very, very fascinating. And I imagine there would have been an even more complex politics when Julia gets involved, far more experienced, the far more sexualized woman. Yeah, that could have been potentially very, very interesting to play with.
Yeah.
But the film kind of doesn't. He is a completely incidental character. And I love the way that when we get to Hellbound, it's just like, we're not even going to bother. We're not even going to. Yeah. I think they mention him once at the beginning of Hellbound, and that's it.
And then Hellbound sort of semi supplies Kirsty with a replacement, who then gets killed very quickly. Who then gets
eaten by Julia. Yeah. In fact, you get that wonderful echo of Frank's line, "She's come to mummy." Yeah. Wonderful. Julia in Hellbound. Brilliant.
Oh character. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Love her.
I have to be honest. Hellbound is the movie that I'm more attached to.
Yes, I agree with you, and I often hear people say, "Oh no, that the Hellraiser is sort of definitive and it should never have had any sequels." But I love Hellbound. I think on a number of for a number of reasons. But it's a cracker. Love it.
For all its flaws, I think Hellbound is probably one of my favorite films of all time, to be honest.
It's a perennial go back to, definitely. It's just brilliant. And
as I was saying earlier, it puts the Cenobites front and center and their world. And frankly, that is the trick Hellraiser plays on us. Although it maintains its interest, it is interesting and smart enough, but as I was saying earlier, none of us actually went in to Hellraiser of the serial killer story of Julia procuring men for Frank. We went in to see Pinhead and the others, and Hellbound gives us what we want.
Yeah,
and tells a very interesting story as well, and it is highly visual as well. But so I always feel slightly cheated by Hellraiser, and Hellbound is like, this is what I came for, and that's the film that's giving it.
I understand that Barker is holding the Cenobites back to an extent in an attempt to heighten their effect. Although I can't help feeling he shows you too much too soon. but for most of the film, they are held in reserve, so that their impact when they turn up is quite striking.
Pretty profound.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that wonderful scene. I mean, it's one of the best sequences in the film, actually, where Kirsty solves plot and they appear to her.
That whole hospital sequence is so odd. From the moment she wakes up after she passes out in the street, and then she wakes up in the hospital, the whole thing seems off. Like you have the nurse sat there just watching apparently a TV show which is just carnations unfolding on the television, which is surreal, wonderfully surreal, but very odd.
Almost strangely. Right?
Yeah, it is Lynchian. Yeah, in that tableau way that he frames scenes. A very strangely bare hotel, hospital room, and the oddly suspicious way that they treat her. They talk to her as if she's been caught committing a crime, and the doctor that comes to talk to her is strangely hostile and suspicious, and her attitude is odd as well to the box. And it's hard not to feel like that entire sequence is in some sort of halfway zone between reality and dream.
Yeah, very much so. There's an almost Alice through the looking glass quality to it.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if her perceptions have been altered by the experience she had at the house, or if something is already seeping out of the box or something like that.
I mean, it's quite well played in that regard. It is well framed. I mean, it's
very unsettling.
It is, and I love the way it communicates that to the audience. You know, it's trying to unsettle us in the same way that she herself, her whole world, has been upended. You know, and it's not even in like a mundane way. It's not because her circumstances have changed. She's actually seen a black miracle, a dark miracle, in the shape of skinless Uncle Frank. I mean, one thing we are cheated of, sadly, in both the book and the film, is what Rory makes of that, or what Larry makes of that. I would have liked to have seen an encounter between the two of them, because I'm sure that would have gone down well.
Well, I think that kind of strengthens my case that they are essentially just the same person, or maybe that was Rob saying that. I don't know, but they are just kind of essentially the same person. So you kind of can't see them meet, and you never do.
Right, yeah.
It's a bit like Superman and Clark Kent can never meet each other, except they do in number 3.
Yeah. I mean, Rob and Elliot are the same person. I mean, it's terrifying.
That's true. Yeah.
It depends on which name you choose at a given point. But it was interesting enough for both of those names. It's just one of those quirks. But I don't know. It's a funny because because when I was watching it and sort of trying to particularly plot through, because we've talked about gender and we've talked about the patriarchy side of things, but plotting the sexuality of it all, because I've realised, rather like the film, we haven't talked about the Cenobites much yet. And I sort of watching, thinking, well, okay, so we've got this premise in which they promise experiences beyond anything even Frank has imagined, which frankly isn't much, frankly, again. But one of the interesting lines in the Hellbound Heart reveals how much they kind of mirror him. Barker has this sentence that he says Frank could only sense their desperation and an appetite that made his bowels ache to be voided, which is a great line. But there's a strong suggestion in the Hellbound Heart that they're in a similar cul-de-sac as he is.
Yeah.
So the story.
Yes.
So there I'm thinking, well, the story has opened itself already to quite a conservative interpretation, because even as a self-professed BDSM experimenter, Barker, it's almost like he's saying through two sets of characters, yeah, but pardon the pun, it starts to suck.
Yeah.
The parallel with so-called gateway drugs, I think, is very strongly in the novella, even more than the film. That, obviously leads, the ideas in leading an addict into similar dead ends. So you start to think, well, is the Hellbound Heart rather like is this a story? Is this a fable about Frank, the heathen man, who just doesn't achieve spirituality and love? Is this just a cautionary tale? Is this at bottom, Hellbound Heart, actually a morality tale.
There is a didactic element to it. There really is. I mean, whether it's and I imagine it's not conscious.
Which seems
that's
so
really
odd when you listen to Barker and you see interviews.
Yes.
Because I think the progressive thing, actually, is, yeah, it draws on queer spaces and aesthetics and BDSM, obviously. It puts those things alongside Frank's, actually, as we've said, pretty milquetoast, heteronormative dom stuff, and says that while one is viewed as legitimate, so therefore normal, heteronormal, it's still about desire and experimentation. And actually, the guys in that household are locked into something more nefarious and horrible than the Cenobites, who seem to be pretty harmonious queer family by comparison. But Barker, as the writer and the filmmaker, still has to make all of this monstrous, because he's writing a horror novel and making a horror film. So as we said earlier, it's bound to a kind of fairy tale thing. It's also got, as Jack was saying, that element of Catholicism, and we should be searching for something. So the book seems to be saying we should be searching for something more meaningful and spiritual, and so he makes his protagonist Kirsty. So the upshot of the whole thing is something that doesn't really, it seems to me anyway, and this is where you might be helpful here, George, because you're more familiar with Barker and his work than I am. But he seems to be on one level supporting and championing things like BDSM and queerness, and then backs and supports this milquetoast straight relationship between Rory and Kirsty as being somehow. I'm talking about the well, obviously, because I've said Rory. The novella now is that, well, actually, they achieved something more. And you think, wow, this is actually quite a conservative morality tale at bottom.
Yes.
I find that quite odd, only in the sense because I expect Barker, having seen him in interviews and knowing what he's like, to actually. I mean, he's just starting out, and I don't know what the pressures on him with publishers were and everything. But the thing to be able to go, you know what, world, screw you. Don't kink shame me. BDSM is great. Queer families, that's the way to go. And fuck these people. But actually, it comes back to a pretty conservative payoff, it seems to me.
I imagine it's simply because of the era in which he's writing and the fact that he is at the very, very, very beginning of his career. And, what the standards of horror fiction are at
the only
time.
thing that makes me think he knows what he's having to do. The only thing that makes me think he knows what he's having to do, like you say, he has to get things through the gates, is he has a wonderful line in the Hellbound Heart where he describes the Cenobites as carrying an odor of vanilla. Yeah. Now, is that his tip of the hat to us going, I know what I have to do? Because why would he describe them as vanilla? Vanilla being obviously, vanilla sex. And there must be anything but. Well, so I'm wondering if it's kind of. But then they are depicted as being sort of trapped in a cul-de-sac. They're bored.
They're bored. Yeah, they are.
They're not passionate creatures.
No, ennui and dispassion and dissatisfaction with one's condition is a consistent theme in both versions of the story. I mean, it's less so for the Cenobites in the film. They're a bit more intent on what they're doing, and they seem to be enjoying it a little bit more as well. And they find Kirsty a little bit of a distraction as well, don't they? I mean, they're enjoying the game. Yeah. When they appear to her in the book, they're actually rather enjoying the whole sort of cat and mouse chase thing that's going on. And in fact, they tease her, don't they? They appear to her. You hear their voices sometimes, and they're saying, "Oh, you lost the game. You lost the game."
Yeah, they are a bit more, if you like, alive in the film. But to have these. I don't know, to have these really fascinating creations that are beyond gender, beyond patriarchy, beyond the heteronormative, not something that Frank bargained on. But I say I'm intrigued why Barker has not presented them as passionate beings in the novella. Yeah. Why they are sterile and cold, and why they seem indifferent and tragic themselves, because I think seems to run against this idea. Of someone who wants to show up. I would have thought wanted to show up, not necessarily positive. He is still writing horror at the end of the day, but something like fiery and fuck you about BDSM and queerness. And he kind of doesn't.
Again, it's something you get sort of solved or ameliorated in Hellbound. You get that wonderful that acknowledgement in Hellbound that what the Cenobites provide is not entirely undesirable. In fact, it can be.
Chandler gets that great line, doesn't he? He said, "Why did I wait so long?" Which I think is a great line. And I don't think it's exactly that.
He emerges from the box where he's been cheese-wired into cenobitism.
Yeah.
And he says, "To think I hesitated."
That's it. To think I hesitated. Yeah.
And it's yes,
but that is just him, though, isn't it?
Of course.
Yes, it is just
the thing. Right. The thing is, in that film, in Hellbound, it is made very clear that the Cenobites are victims. They are people who have been taken and transformed and enslaved, essentially, and used. And the film has this incredibly poignant moment where Kirsty frees them. So it's clear in Hellbound that we are talking. And I think the solution to this problem lies in whether we look at the Cenobites as a depiction of BDSM or as a depiction of something else, which is using BDSM as a way of getting at what it's actually a depiction of. BDSM is a way for people to navigate their feelings about the fact that we're all, to one extent or another, we're all brought up from childhood, which is love and punishment are sort of inherently linked in childhood. We're all brought up in systems of power relationships and domination and hierarchy and stuff like that. And we're also we're living in an industrial civilization where people are alienated from their own bodies and each other's bodies. We're surrounded by the human body is incredibly surrounded by and interrelated with technology and machinery everywhere. That's what BDSM's about. It's kind of like the meeting of the flesh with the hard produced material stuff. We're all subjected to these libidinized hierarchical power structures. People are commodified in commodity fetishism. People are treated as things are treated as people, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's what BDSM is an attempt to deal with people, to try to negotiate their feelings about living in that world, right? And it's not moral or immoral until, of course, people start doing things to each other that one party hasn't committed to. It's not a question until you get to stuff like that, which is just general. That's nothing to do with BDSM in particular. Until you get there, it's not a question of morality. It's just a question of people negotiating their feelings and their fantasies and how they feel about living in this world. Right now, I think this is a film very much about patriarchy, and if you look at, the Cenobites they're kind of empty and dry and arid and petty and unsympathetic and hypocritical. They're not aspirational figures. They are kind of fascinating and wonderful and beautiful, etc., but they are ultimately sterile, aren't they? In both versions, they are ultimately sterile. And I think it's because they are.
There's nowhere for them to go.
They are trapped in the system that is the box, as much as that they are caught in the box, as much as people are caught by the box, if you know what I mean. They can't not do what they do. Even in the novella, there's a bit where one of the Cenobites says to Kirsty, she realizes that Kirsty opened the box in ignorance, and she said, "Yes, it happens. There's no help for it." They are they're as much bound by these rules as anybody else.
And consent is a big thing, because when they realize she's not gone into the box with a certain intent,
it does make a difference.
Consent is definitely there. And I think Barker's very good on that, about showing that the Cenobites have got this conception of consent, which is really interesting.
It's slightly muddy at the end of the film, and I go back and forth on this. I find it disappointing in some ways that they kind of renege on their deal with Kirsty. At the same time, thinking about it, it does kind of work for my reading. If you think of them as almost a religious order, and that's what Cenobite means.
That's what Cenobite means.
A member of a religious order. And you, George, have used the word papal. There is something religious about them. Religious orders are always about power. They're always about, even in the absence of the direct power of the bishop or whatever, people in religious orders try to reinforce their own devotion, their own place in the order. And it involves all sorts of masochistic and sadistic rituals. If you read the chapters of Melmoth the Wanderer that are set in the monastery, it's this sort of network of sadism and masochism where these guys are keeping themselves in line in this power structure through these forms of torture and domination. And it all works. It's for social cohesion. It's for reinforcing social cohesion within these sorts of collective power structures. And that ties in what I was saying about BDSM. I think what Barker is using the aesthetics of BDSM combined with the aesthetics of religion to an extent, to try to get at this. And very specifically in the film and in the book, it's very much about the relationships between men and women, the bourgeois family, the nuclear family, and I think it is ultimately about patriarchy.
But I think you're absolutely right on this, Jack. I do think you're absolutely right. My only slight worry, because I worry a lot about things, is that because certainly at this point, images of BDSM were not de rigueur in cinema or
no, they definitely were not.
No, and unfortunately, I think your reading is really spot on, but you're still left with or at least I am. I'm still left with a slight sense of, but it means that by the close of the film, it stays in the arena, if you like, of the negatively transgressive. That it is still the trace of left of something negative, ugly, horrifying, and that's not what I want to be left with. Even though I think there is a more complex story, and I think your reading is absolutely there, but there is just that something of a disappointment that I come at the end of it going, this is a guy who really understands this world. This is a gay man who has gone into these worlds, and this in so many ways terrific and smart story. That one of the things that leaves over at the end is the idea that these things are negative, and that's hard to shake. Even with the sort of intellectual stock of what you're saying, it's really hard to shake that feeling of. I didn't want to be left with such a negative connotation because no one else is doing anything but negative connotations, even if they go near this stuff at all. And of course, in that period, with the AIDS panic and everything else, it's uncomfortable.
This is interesting. This is not unlike a discussion that we had when we talked about The Witch, the Robert Eggers movie, where we talked at the end about whether or not, is it Abigail, the character's name? Whether or not she is liberated by the contract she signs at the end, or whether she is... Yeah, or whether she is just inducted into a different kind of commodified, patriarchal power relationship. And I think I feel like and it's not unlike a discussion I had with Daniel Harper and Lee Russell when I was on They Must Be Destroyed on Sight, and we talked about Blue Velvet, because Blue Velvet is another film which has on the surface at least, a very negative depiction of what you could call kink, BDSM play and stuff like that. And I remember that made Daniel uncomfortable in a similar way. I think to what you're saying, and I think there is I think you're both right to say that there is a problem, that there is a fundamental conservative reading that is not being evaded. Is not being, a way round it is not being found in some way in all these instances. Barker's very aware of this. Barker's written about, the essential shape of the horror story is conservative. The alien threat comes into the normal world and then is banished after threatening to disorganize everything that's good in the status quo. He knows
as I said at the beginning, it's in the genre, isn't it? The genre is.
And again, contextually, bearing in mind, this is like mid-1980s.
Yeah.
So in order to get this even produced or published in any way, shape or form, it would have had to have towed certain lines.
Yeah, I agree. I think as I say, I think that the justification makes it sound like Jack's an apologist, and that's not what I'm trying to say. I think the justification is sound. I think it's valid because the film is operating. But it's almost like now, I'm not saying this of Barker. I'm not saying Barker's being duplicitous, but that kind of duplicitous thing that sometimes, well, not even sometimes, too often crops up in fiction, where it's the show you one thing, tell you the other. Kind of scenario, and it's like. It's just, as I say, it's just hard to shake. This is someone who is basically dragging something into the mainstream, which no one wanted to go near.
I think you're right.
Particularly with the reaction, and then of course by the end of it, you're left with but it's still is still it's still negative and ugly and sterile and awful and that's that's just hard to let go of. But at the same time, I do think what you've argued is absolutely valid. But you've just got to trust that the audience is going to go that far into it.
I think the escape hatch is the sublimity of the Cenobites. They are completely negative in literal terms in the frame of the story, and yet, of course, as you've said, they are the thing that we came to see. They are the thing that we want to see, and the fact that they're held back and held in reserve so much only makes them more desirable. We want to look at them. We like looking at them. They are the exciting thing about the story. For all the negative things that the connotations that they bring with them, you come away from the film just enraptured with them aesthetically.
Yes. And with the benefit of hindsight, we know that that's what people latched onto.
And the thing is, like,
we know that's what people responded to.
And Barker is very good, even at the point he's writing from, at trying to get his point across. I mean, there's a great moment that comes back to something I think you were saying, Jack, about Julia's role, and this is in the novella, where when you were saying that Rory and Frank are basically the same pathetic guy that she has to deal with, and I took a note of the line, and it says, he was kneeling in front of her, his unfinished hands were at her hips, then his mouth, forsaking the dregs of her distaste, she put a hand upon his head, and felt the hair silken like a baby's, and the shell of his skull beneath. It's Mummy again, isn't it? It's like you say, it's but totally, this is from Frank this time, and moments like that are so insightful and really grasp the nettle of Julia as a victim of patriarchy. So it's a divided ethic.
What's also happening there is that Julia is
You're thinking of Imagica, aren't you, Jack?
I'm thinking of Imagica, exactly. Julia is doing what Frank failed to do. She is taking pleasure in horror. She is achieving it. She has transcended disgust, pain, horror, transgression, violation, and found pleasure in it.
Yeah.
That is something that she can do. Because she's a woman.
Yeah, because she's a woman, right? And it's part and parcel of being a woman in patriarchy. Yeah, you have to do that. You have to do that.
Patriarchy constructs the woman. This is not anything to do with real people. Obviously, this is a construction that is put onto human beings.
Yeah.
It constructs the woman as the object rather than the subject, the one who is done to rather than who does, the one who is experienced rather than who experiences. It constructs the woman as the one who is penetrated, the one who has to subject herself to power, etc., etc. And it imposes that, or tries to impose it, on half the human race. What patriarchy misses, that's not untrue, but it's the truth is that that's all of us. That's the entire human race. We are all suffering meat that is acted upon, that is at the mercy of forces outside ourselves. That's not just women. That's everybody who's ever lived. But patriarchy says, no, not men. Not this category of people over here that we're going to call men. No. They're in charge. They're the ones who act, who do, who penetrate. It's you down here. You're the object, not the subject. You're the one that is penetrated. What the Cenobites do is that they turn everybody into a woman in that sort of patriarchal ideological sense.
Yes.
Everybody who comes, they are completely undiscriminating. It doesn't matter what gender or sex you are. They will turn you into a woman in the sense that they will turn you into the object that experiences, that is acted upon, that is penetrated, that is complete, that is stripped of power, etc., etc. And what they ask you to do is to find sublimity and transgression in that. Well, men can't do it.
Are doing what xenomorphs do.
Men can't do it, but Julia can,
and
because Julia does, and
in
Julia
fact,
then
makes
because
her
she's
kind
so
of double dom at one point, because when she's because I mean all that dom and sub roles get, she gets really interestingly switch you, because on one hand, of course, because he's working in the horror genre, which we have said and he has acknowledged is conservative with the small c. One moment she is Fay Ray in The Monster's Arms, that classic image of a woman embraced by, whether it's a vampire or a werewolf or a beast, that the connotation being it will sexually dominate her explicitly if it's a vampire, provided with an intensity that the sappy prince or the woodcutter or the pure boyfriend can't. But of course must win back purity come the end. But when she's out getting flesh for Frank, luring men to the damp room, she's a double dom.
Yeah,
she relies on the mistress to make him whole again.
Yeah,
she has internalized
and
she has internalized and weaponized the patriarchal conception of woman. Exactly. She is now using it against. She is doing to men what the Cenobites did to Frank. Literally, she is luring them into a box. We've already talked about the house and the box being the same. She lures them in, and then she penetrates them.
Yeah,
and they stay in the room. They are consumed.
Yeah. And what's so incendiary about it is that she finds power in it. She finds something that patriarchy doesn't prescribe, and she feeds on it in a way.
This is why it's so frustrating that the Cenobites don't seem to notice, Julia.
Yeah,
because you think the minute the Cenobites turn up in that situation, they should be like, "Oh, who's this interesting person?"
Yes.
Yeah, but this is what I'm saying about why I get this kind of push me pull you sensation with both the novella and the film, which is there's moments where it's like, oh yeah, he's but of course, I'm also reading, watching, consuming it from a particular political position, and one has to accept that in fiction, and particularly this kind of genre fiction, there are both the potential for conservative, reactionary, and radical forces to act on it. He's not in the business of writing a didactic thing to suit my politics, but it does mean that you can. But then even the feeling of frustration is good. I mean, it's
temporarily, of course, we're also reading it in 2025, and this was a book published in 1986, 1987. It's absolutely. I mean,
and in
the gender
that context,
politics,
just the fact that he's got that
incendiary.
politics in it, just the fact that he's got images of BDSM in it, even if they do ultimately come out as being negative, the fact that they're there is pretty incendiary.
And the fact that you have the female sort of protagonist and antagonist serial killer. That was just,
and the fact that even though it was low budget, it was a mainstream film.
It was surprisingly.
It was really known. Everyone knew about it. It wasn't some little art house horror or on the fringe of pop culture flick. It was really well known.
It was very popular, which I mean, of course, is why the sequel came out so quickly after. It was optioned immediately.
Yeah,
but it's one of those properties that is simultaneously mainstream and also just kind of inimical to the mainstream, which is why they've spent so long since then trying to make it into something other than what it is. If you watch the first two films, and then you watch the rest of, I haven't seen any more than the third one. Actually, I've seen 1, 2, and 3, but I've heard about the others. And number 3, although it's quite fun, it isn't. It is very definitely an attempt to turn. It's an almost conscious attempt to neuter and empty it and turn Pinhead into like Freddy.
It's Freddy Krueger. He's wisecracking. He's funny. It's a Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a Nightmare on Elm Street.
The best sequel, really,
and it also makes it
Hellraiser and Hellbound. Is, I think, David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, because that uses boxes to tear people into alternate realities and fresh hellscapes, but it doesn't do Hellraiser dead on. It's I think it's David Lynch's askance version of Hellraiser, because I tell you, he would have been there for that shit. I bet he saw Hellraiser. I mean, this is the guy who did Eraserhead. He would have been into that shit.
Of course he would have been.
I'm convinced that Mulholland Drive is his take on Hellraiser, even down to like the boxes.
I think there's bits of Hellraiser in Firewalk with Me, particularly if you look at the way televisions are concentrated upon in that, and the television is just another type of magic box that takes you to a different place, which is something that's.
He just makes it that little bit more pronounced on Mulholland Drive because those boxes are so like
like
so
the lens configuration.
the vent configuration, and then just the little, because he always does things as if he always has things happening just off screen. There's always another film or another narrative off screen, and even the thing with the situation with discovering the creature behind the Winkies bar. It's so Hellraiser. That's what he's tapping into.
That's very true. Yes, yes.
And that's it, because for someone who had the reputation of an art house director, he absolutely loved and consumed mainstream things, or things that were posited as popular or populist. That's why his films that was something he was very honest about.
Yeah, he was a fan of soap operas, wasn't he? He absolutely adored soap operas by all accounts. Which you can see in Twin Peaks, of course.
Of course,
absolutely.
He understands the language.
So for me, Mulholland Drive is the third Hellraiser film.
It's the third Hellraiser.
But of course, there's just imagery in the film that is so far and beyond anything that's happening in what is it, 1986?
I'm sort of the view, actually, as much as I'll say how good a prose writer Clive Barker was even then, and how the novella is engaging. But I really think this was a story that cried out to be made into a film. It needs actors. It needs that very visual language, which is conveyed. I get a little bit upset sometimes when people automatically or knee-jerk value the printed word over
absolutely,
images.
Absolutely.
It's more nuanced and complex than
it
that.
Absolutely is. Some work.
This is something that needed to be done visually. It needed to have actors in it, I think. The actors do so much. Not just Claire Higgins, but with the dramatization of Pinhead, although he only gets very few lines of dialogue, the impact of that voice and the stillness of that
Doug
performance
Bradley is pretty goddamn amazing, actually. The presence, and again, as you say, it is not just the makeup. As impressive as the makeup and the framing and whatnot is, there is something about his presence. Apparently, the note that Barker kept giving him as a director is turn it down.
Yeah.
Turn it down, turn it down, turn it down, turn it down, turn it down. He wanted the Cenobites to have this regality about them, this stillness.
Which certainly, again, made sense in that era, because, it is the era where, of the Krugers and everything, the wisecracking.
Capering, sort of wisecracking, chasing down the street kind of character,
Yeah.
He wanted,
even if they're silent, someone like a Jason Voorhees or something.
Right. Which Barker has no time for. He's actually quite excoriating about that whole. He hates all of that. He's always said that Pinhead would be at home amongst Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. He's got that sort of loquacious quality as well, where even though he doesn't speak very much, he can turn a phrase.
Yeah,
the talking monster, the intelligent monster, monster with philosophy, with ideology, right? And that's one of the other things that's so interesting about Hellraiser.
He doesn't cackle.
It doesn't cackle, right? And isn't just the threat of Hellraiser that one of the most interesting things about the Cenobites is what they provide or what they promise isn't just death. I mean, that ultimately that's it in most mainstream horror franchises, isn't it? It's things killing you in various ways.
Yeah.
This death isn't the end here. Death is just the beginning. It's
death might be a release.
Right. It is way worse than just dying.
Yeah.
And can potentially be much better as well, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah.
But they are wonderful designs. I mean, just aesthetically, the way the different designs of the Cenobites convey character is fascinating, and the way people have taken them to their hearts. I mean, the Chatterer.
Yes, and of course the backstory for the Chatterer is so so tragic.
It's pretty nasty, isn't it? It's pretty goddamn unpleasant.
And of course, I'd forgotten, because I've been so focused on Hellraiser. It wasn't until Jack said earlier, well, of course, don't forget Cenobites have all. So, of course, yes, they have all these backstories. They're victims.
Yeah.
And that particular aspect of it did get lost because I was sort of super focusing on this text.
Yeah, the implications of where the Chatterer comes from in Hellbound are just awful. I mean, I dread to think. I dread to think of what the backstory there is. Yeah. I'm sure someone has tried to tell it at some point, but it doesn't. It doesn't require it. It doesn't require being told.
Yeah, we're good.
I mean, there is a massive extended universe. I mean, there's a huge extended universe of Hellraiser. There's comics and all sorts of different media about them, and some of it's very good, and some of it's not. Some of it goes too deep. It tries to provide too much in the way of explanation. It plays off of what's established in Hellraiser and Hellbound, and then goes way too far. Way too far. I mean, one of the things that happens in the comics is that the notion of Leviathan as being this gigantic configuration is taken very literally, and Leviathan becomes a god of order. That's also why it imposes patterns upon the flesh. It's trying to impose organization on something inherently chaotic, and it's interesting, but it doesn't work for me. It really doesn't work for me.
Yes,
well, it's interesting.
It hits with you were saying about Chatterer, isn't it? It's the delicacy of when you get into the realms of explaining things. That's
what's so good about Hellbound as a film. There is so much mythology in Hellbound. There's so much that is explored, but not much that's actually explained.
Not explained. They're in nice depths. Yeah.
That works so beautifully. It's got such a lightness of touch about it. But this film does as well.
This is our second encounter with an entity that is called Leviathan.
Yes.
Not necessarily by itself, but by the people around it. And it in both cases, it is made from or surrounded by or fed by bodily mutilation of different types.
Interesting. Yeah, very. I mean, I do wonder, because I know that Barker after Hellraiser, he kind of abandoned the franchise himself. He did a few other bits and pieces in the comics and whatnot, but not very much. It would have been very interesting.
He took a check for putting his name on number 3.
Yeah, he did.
Who can blame him?
And apparently there was a script that he wrote for 3 that was very, very, very different from what was eventually filmed. There were a couple of elements that were fed through. So the whole notion of Pinhead being in this pillar and erupting out of it at some point. That was part of Barker's script, apparently, but everything else is just it's the work of someone else. Although God bless him, Doug Bradley has stuck with that character.
Probably not a bad oatmeal ticket, is it?
I suppose it's not, but wow, the
Particularly
films.
If you're a jobbing character actor, it's difficult to get work.
I've seen most of them. I haven't seen all of them. I've seen most of them, and they are dreck.
Frankly,
they're absolute
if you've
dreck.
got control over something in an industry like that, why you don't let it go?
No, absolutely. I mean, he's very eloquent about that. Doug Bradley, when he's interviewed, he obviously doing the original Hellraiser. He never thought for 2 seconds that he'd be playing the character ever again.
No, of course not.
As you wouldn't. No. I mean, there was no notion the film would be as successful as it was. But as it turns out, he's played it for practically a lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, we joke about. Well, I joked about Jason Voorhees, but it's a similar thing with. Although that's been played by lots of different people, but it's a similar thing with. Is it Kane Hodder, who played him for a chunk of the films, how proprietorial he became about it, and how freaking work he did of what is ostensibly trashy films. Good for you, man, because that's your little corner of little bit of history in pop culture, and you've taken control of this.
There's a sequence in Hellraiser 3 where you have Doug Bradley playing Elliot Spencer, the man who Pinhead used to be, opposite Pinhead. The two are existing in the same space and time. And Doug Bradley described seeing someone else in his makeup at one point and really not liking it.
It's funny, actually,
having this reaction to it.
Yeah. That's mine.
Yeah, but I've read this several times. Funny enough, we come full circle here with mentioning the Matrix earlier in Doctor Who. But people who've played Doctor Who saying it couldn't stand being on the set when the next actor in the regeneration scene. Peter Davison said it. He said he was like, suddenly I was aching to get out of this role. I wanted to do other things. I was still a young actor. He said, and I saw the next guy just in my costume. He said, and suddenly I was like, I wasn't even very courteous with him when he, very kindly asked for advice. He said, because it was like, what the no, and he's not the only one. I think someone else said that he would. Can't remember. Another Doctor Who had said that they couldn't wait to get off the set when they saw the guy in the replica of their costume about to do their first line. You think? Ooh.
I mean, I kind of get it.
I think that was Tom, wasn't it? Because famously, Tom snuck away on the last day of filming. Everybody said,
actually as well. One of the new ones has also been very. I just can't remember which it was. It wasn't Eccleston because he'd already gone. They had.
He was well out of it.
To cobble it together. Might have even been Tennant, but said I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't stay on set.
Wow.
But Tom definitely, yeah.
Tom very famously
the last him as well. John Pertwee actually got off the set and was very grumbly.
Pertwee was terribly sad at that point because he loads of people had died, hadn't they? And he just felt like Roger Delgado had died, and he felt like the gang had broken up, and he was like, fuck this, I'm out. Tom very famously, the last day of filming, they looked around and like, where's Tom? Let's all go to the pub and celebrate. And he'd already gone. Fucked off.
But I sort of get it. I get, I've never had that sort of experience where I've had a role that's been entirely my creation, and therefore, and then you could give it up to someone.
If you are so positively identified with that character, when people see that character, they think of you.
Yeah,
that must be very difficult. Although I mean, recently we did have was it 2022? There was the resurrected Hellraiser that had Jamie Clayton as the help.
I've yet to see that. I want to see it, but I need to be in the right headspace.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you can tell that it's very much like there's something very much akin to this film, to the original Hellraiser about it, in the sense that
it is supposed to be a remake of this story, isn't it? I've heard anyway.
No.
No? Right. Okay.
No. It's a totally removed.
Right. Well, that's. I'd heard that it was a remake of the Hellbound Heart, so that's interesting.
Oh no, not at all.
Okay,
not at all. It's a very different piece of work. It even reimagines the mythology in certain key ways. So there are the lament configuration, for example, is only one of the configurations of the box. It can be twisted into other shape.
That's heavily implied in the first two movies as well, isn't it? There's a really interesting moment in Hellraiser where Kirsty is playing around with the box, and you start to see it emit, the way it emits these little pulses of energy.
Yes.
And it emits some of a color that we haven't seen before. And you think if you just carried on down that road the way you're going, you might open a door to a completely different place.
Other places. That's exactly what the new Hellraiser kind of runs with, the notion that there are different configurations of the box that do different things, that have different qualities about them, and the lament configuration is just one. That's the one that summons the Cenobites. And it's trying to find its feet. You can definitely feel that it's not quite baked yet. But what they do with certain aspects of the mythology is really interesting. I mean, really interesting. I liked the new Cenobites are excellent. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful. And Jamie Clayton as the lead Cenobite, the Hell Priest, it's her film. Frankly, it's her film. It such presence. I mean, absolutely incredible. There's wonderful stuff done because, of course, the technology now is much more advanced than it ever was before. They do things with the way the world of the Cenobites intersect with ours that is wild. It's absolutely wacky. There's a point where someone who has opened the box is in the back of a van and they're speeding away, and the labyrinth opens in the back of the moving van.
Oh, wow.
And it's really strange and wonderful. There are elements of it I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed. It's the beginning of something. It's not quite there yet. But I imagine if they do another one, there's potential for it to be very good. I do feel, though, that this mythology, it would probably benefit from being a series now, existing in that format.
Yeah,
There's so much wider mythology built up around it now, and there's so much you could explore. I mean, the films do try to explore at one point, like who Le Marchand was and where the box came from and all that gubbins. Doesn't do it very well, sadly. But there's loads of potential there, isn't there? Like,
hugely
the boxes,
so. Yeah.
The boxes. I mean, we know from Hellbound there's more than one, because Ken Cranham has multiple boxes under glass. One of the things the comic play with is that it doesn't have to be one of these devices. It can be almost anything that has an obsessive quality, where you're trying to solve something or trying to get something. So there is a story, and sadly it's written by the absolutely loathsome Neil Gaiman. The story itself, sadly, is very good. It's a one-shot Hellraiser comic about a man who is very, very sort of dusty, very timid and conservative, and obsessed with words. He's a librarian. He's obsessed with books, loves the book, and he likes word puzzles. He likes crosswords and things like that. And there's a gentleman on a train who gives him a puzzle, which when he first sees it, he's like, "Oh, this is nothing special whatsoever." It's like a crossword, but it's in the shape of a spiral.
Right.
And it turns out that the clues, as cryptic as they are, relate to things in his own life.
Uzumaki.
Yeah, exactly. It's very that. It's very that, and that's what opens the way into hell, ultimately into Leviathan's hell. So it can be anything. It can be almost anything.
That's who should be writing Hellraiser comics. Junji Ito. Wow.
Oh God, yes. 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 Absolutely, yes. I mean, now one of the wonderful things that's happening in the horror communities at the moment is, of course, there are now, people find it's difficult to express just what Barker did when he made Hellraiser, when he wrote his books. He opened the gates for us. He he didn't just open the gates, he blew them off their hinges.
Yeah,
so suddenly, we've always been in horror, we've always been in genre fiction. It's always called out to us, as outcasts, as queer people. We've always been there, but we've never had any prescribed space in it before. And Barker allowed for that. On the back of Barker, you get Billy Martin, aka Poppy Z. Bright. Right. Yeah. And it just cascades. You get Paula D'Ash, you get Eric LaRocca, you get all of us, all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it all starts here.
Which actually, that puts a bit of a different gloss on the fact that inevitably, if you're at the start of something, it can't help but be a little bit compromised if you're going to get it out there.
Right.
Because and actually, in many ways, it is still incendiary. The fact that the content that he gets and the imagery that he gets into these pieces from 40 years ago are even there, because it is then, as you say, the gates are blown open, and then it's what the next person does, and then what the next person does, and also what he does subsequently. And of course, it is there. It is there in later novels and short stories where they aren't as perhaps problematic as Hellbound Heart and Hellraiser, because he's through the gates that he's blown open.
Yeah. Did you get, by the way, guys, when you read Weaveworld, did you notice the subtle point where the Cenobites are referenced?
Oh yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's that throwaway line where Immaculata has she talks about having had a paramour at one point. And
it's the rake, isn't it?
That's right. He accidentally. That's right. It's implied that She says that at some point in his dabblings, he'd summoned some otherworldly surgeons.
That's
and
right.
when there was nothing left of him, when there was only blood, he begged me to take his soul, so I did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Immaculata, oh my God. Favorite character in all of Barker.
Oh, yeah, incredible.
Oh, yeah.
Love
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible.
Love her.
Yeah.
Could totally see why there are cults that worship her as like some divine Madonna or something. You know, it's like, yeah, absolutely. Why not? You know?
That's wicked. So where does this put us now on our journey? I mean, what?
Well, I was going to say that was a really great discussion about Robin Redbreast and Dead of Night, guys. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, there's so much, isn't there? There's so much.
Hey, plans change.
Well.
Plans change.
Yeah.
I rewatched them, and in fact, I mean, what an idiot! Because oh yes, you would have known about this as well, George. I leapt on a bunch of recommendations that Jack gave a few months ago now, because it was absolutely, we're deep into our folklore and folk horror bit, and he was like, oh yeah, like The Outcasts and Ennis Men, and I remembered Winstanley, but I hadn't seen it in years, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go out and grab all these. Slacken the Painter, obviously, from because I've read the story so many times, like, oh god, they did. And then literally apoplectic on the weekend that I sat down to watch The Outcasts, and the bloody thing doesn't work. It's a multi-region DVD player. I've got region 2, and like really pissed. And then suddenly realizing it a day later, it's like, oh, you physically got to change the region. And
what kind of bloody player needs you to manually tell it?
My last one didn't.
To be fair, I've never seen that before. I have never seen that where you've got to do it manually. I mean, what a ball ache.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, I feel a dick now. And I was a proper, bottom lip stuck out child about it. Because I was so looking forward to it. And then Ennis Men wouldn't work either. And then I was like, well, at least Ennis Men has got a DVD in with the Blu-ray, so the DVD worked. It was, okay, that's something. So why is the Blu-ray working? But then the next day I realised it was actually all working, and I was just a dick.
I love a good temper tantrum. I love to witness a good temper tantrum.
And I think I just had a total Larry moment as far as Vic was concerned.
But next, I don't know, guys. I mean, what would you like to do? I think I've settled on the game I'm going to talk to you guys about, like, endlessly. It's going to be Bloodborne.
Oh yes, the game.
Oh my God, Bloodborne is for me top 3 games of all time ever.
Oh, that is
quite possibly.
Accolades.
It's Bloodborne. Well, let me put it this way: Bloodborne, I have done 4 Let's Plays of on my channel.
Oh God! Wow.
With a possible 5th in the innings.
Wow!
It's so. If I start, then we won't stop. But it is a stunning example of how narrative in video games is very different from other mediums and has become its own thing. Certainly in recent years, when Bloodborne does it just sublimely, just beautifully. The way that it communicates narrative and mythology through environmental cues and details and things that only really work when you can interact with the environment or when you can move through it yourself. I've never really come across anything such incredible sophistication.
See, this whole medium I've missed out on.
Yeah, I'm a total. I have no idea.
Just nothing. It's so embarrassing.
Honestly,
an entire area of culture, I just know.
Honestly,
no idea.
I've got this thing on my phone where I sort of stack multicolored hexagons, and that's about the best I can do when it comes to video games.
Honestly,
well, maybe we can put in the in the WhatsApp maybe where we might go next with, or what we might return to, or whatever. I mean, I say the only thing I can do in advance is slightly apologise for not being able as regularly, but just everything is. I mean, I'm glad actually everything's exploded a bit. I'm kind of glad, because it was a slight worry back there, because we all need those little bits of paper to keep functioning.
Yeah.
But certainly, I'm certainly not meaning to go such long gaps. But yeah.
Oh, no problem, really. I mean, to be perfectly honest, the last couple of months, so much has given just because of pressures and stresses and lacking energy, quite frankly. So much has given.
Yeah, it's the best laid plans and all that, isn't it?
But no, we'll. I mean, whenever's good for everyone, we'll do the next video and whatever anyone really wants to do. Whatever we settle on.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. This is very sort of like, oh, let's do this, wasn't it? So
yeah, it's fun. But on that note, I might have to dash a minute because I've got to get up stupid o'clock tomorrow.
Oh no! Yeah. Before we go, anything that you guys want to pimp out there?
As ever, nothing specifically. Now that I'm working again, and if anyone is just daft enough to want to listen to my voice more, there will be more things coming out soon. But they are very much in genres that no one wants to listen to. But dare I say? So yes, nothing specific. But if you want to hear me rambling about this, that, and the other, I'm on Blue Sky, and there you go.
Excellent. If you want to check the links, I'll put them below. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Cool. I'm on Blue Sky too. I'm on Blue Sky too at Times Carcass. I blog at Eruditorium Press. Haven't been posting much lately, but the M.R. James series is not over. It's not gone away. It is still more of it coming. I feel like I'll probably be posting an essay about Hellraiser, actually, because I made some notes after thinking about my rewatch for this episode that I think form the basis of an essay. So there might be an essay coming along about Hellraiser fairly soon. That's at Eruditorium Press. I Don't Speak German is the podcast that I do with Daniel Harper about the far right. We're back after a bit of a hiatus. We've got some new stuff out. We've got some new stuff coming.
Well, you've got a lot to deal with, haven't you, at the moment? There's no dearth of material now.
Yeah. I keep on hoping that the podcast will suddenly become, irrelevant and we can retire it. But no sign of that anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Definitely not.
And what have I said? Oh, yeah, and a Patreon. You get advance access to anything that I do in time to give you advance access if you give me just $1 a month. And that does include bonus episodes of I Don't Speak German. And that's me.
Excellent. Links to all of that below, guys. As for myself, you can find me here on Exaggerated Elegy. It's been a bit quiet around here of late. I mean, the video game Let's Plays have just dropped off completely. I just haven't had the energy. Quite frankly, I've been so busy with one thing and another and haven't had the energy for it. You can find links to all of my published work over at strangeplaygrounds.com and on the Evil Empire of Amazon. If you type in George Daniel Lee, you'll find my author page there. Like Jack, I actually will have an essay on Hellbound and Hellraiser coming out over at Ginger Nuts.
I suppose I better do one then, really.
Based on this, it was as a result of reading the book and watching the film again for this discussion. That's over at gingernutsofhorror.com. It's not out yet. It'll be out very soon. In fact, there's 3 in the offing. There's that. There's an essay about Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, which was my first Lovecraft story I ever read. And there's also going to be one about Nosferatu, I do believe, coming out relatively soon. Poignantly for this episode, Arrow Films, go and get the Quartet of Torment Blu-ray set of Hellraiser. And myself and Kit Power are on Hellbound. We're on the Hellbound disc, and we're on the featurette. Hell is what they wanted. It's it's pretty good. Even we're pretty proud. Yeah, we're pretty proud of it. And that's me, guys. It's been so nice. It's been lovely catching up again.
Yeah,
it really has. Really has. Always is. Until next time. Bye bye.
Take care.
Bye bye.